おはようございます。本日は、寒いところというかこの部屋が暑いのにというどっちを言っていいかよくわからないんですけれども、お集まりいただきましてありがとうございます。本日司会を担当いたします、清水明子です。で、ちょっと言語切り替えます。すいません。We are very honored and happy to share with you this great occasion to get together this morning and listen to one of the most personally, I would like to simply say the most, but I'm making every effort not to sound too much as a fan here. So I would just say one of the most influential feminist intellectuals of our time. I honestly do not believe that she needs any further introduction, and I know for a fact that you would be hoping me to be quiet already, and so you can listen to her talk. But please bear with me for another second, and let me introduce Professor Kitada Akihiro first for the greeting message from the organizer.
私は日本語で参ります。今ただいまご紹介に預かりました北田と申します。今回の主催団体である東京大学のですね AMSEA、社会を施行する芸術のためのアートマネジメント育成事業というものの何と言いますかチーフをやっております。で、こういう形式的な挨拶はさっさと終わらせるのが筋だと思いますので大急ぎでお話ししますが、もう皆さんバトラーさんについてはご説明の必要はないかと思います。もちろんカリフォルニア大学バークレー校の教授であられて、クイア理論、セクシャリティ論、そこはフェミニズム等々の分野で多大な影響と、パワーを与えてくださった方です。ちょうど私が大学生ぐらいの時にジェンダートラブルが出まして、ジェンダートラブルの役はそのだいぶ後でしたが、引き続いてちょうどボディーズ・ザット・マターが出されていて、皆さん熱心に読んでいた記憶があります。それは研究者アクティビストを問わず、バトラーさんの言葉に非常に触発されていたというのを記憶しております。なぜかですね、ジェンダートラブルとあれですね、エクサイタブルスピーチの間に、位置するボディーズ・ザット・マターは日本語訳が出ていないのですが、これから出ます。ですが大変その重要な概念、ジェンダートラブルで提起された問題をさらに進化させていく意味でも非常に重要な著作であると思います。今回、ご相談申し上げて、バトラーさんの方からバトラー教授の方からですね「ボディーズ・ザット・スティル・マター」という、非常に刺激的なタイトルをいただきました。我々としては近年というか最近出ましたそのアセンブリの議論なども意識しながらですね、なぜ今またいまだにあるいは今もなお今だからこそ身体というものが問題にされなければならないのか、問題となるのか、そういった問題について今日お話しさせていただきたいと思います。ということで、もうこの程度であとは詳しいことは皆さんご存知だと思います。ちょっと事務的といいますか形式的に、いろいろと簡単にお話をいたしますが、この会の設計に関しましては主催はAMSEAの方になっております、東京大学AMSEAになっておりますが、表彰文化論コース、総合文化研究科の、表彰文化論コース、今清水先生が所属されている、コースですが、そちらの多大なるお力添えをいただきました。また先日講演会を開かれていた明治大学文学部の先生方にも大変大きな協力をいただきました。さらに協力としてさまざまな団体がご協力していただきました。大変ありがたく思っております。この機会にですね、さらにバトラー理論、それからバトラーさんの思想といったものを理解していく輪が広がっていくことを心より願っております。それでは、はい、以上でご挨拶をとさせていただきます。
Thank you very much, Professor Kitada. And before introducing Professor Butler, could we all take a moment to remember the late Professor Takemura Kazuko, whose translation works, both literal and cultural, opened the way for many of us in Japan to access Professor Butler's thoughts. I would also like to remember many other feminist and queer thinkers, writers, activists, and artists as well, who have helped us survive, think, and imagine otherwise. Thank you very much. Now, without further ado, please welcome Professor Judith Butler.
Maybe now you can. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you. I am, of course, very honored to be here and to speak to you today. And I would like first to thank my wonderful hosts here at the university and also the translators who make it possible for us to communicate as well as we can. I'm not sure there could be feminist or queer theory without translation. I think it is the precondition of our being able to communicate and to be able to discuss within a global framework. So for them, I am particularly grateful. I am honored as well to be among the friends and former students and colleagues of Takamura Kazuko, who was, as you know, a wonderful and incisive philosopher. And a very generous person. She was interested in the problems posed by my book called Bodies That Matter, and she sought to pursue her own singular inquiry into feminism, psychoanalysis, and cultural representations. She was, as you may know, a very courageous thinker, and I dedicate my reflections today to her memory and to her continuing spirit. Some people have argued that mourning, even public grieving, can never be political, and that political acts are different from acts of mourning. But when populations are erased by war or famine, and these deaths could have been avoided, it would appear that the public acknowledgement of loss is crucial to the act of protest. I want to suggest that it is political to assert the grievability of persons. And here I'm hoping with the word grievability, I have not imposed too much of a burden on my translators. It is an awkward word. It doesn't work in English, by the way. What does it mean to be grievable? Is it an aspect of an individual, a group, the population in a region, a nation, or a transnational community? We can think about the number of women and trans people who are killed throughout the world on the grounds that they are women or they are trans, or and we can also understand this as, I think, an act of masculine domination. Very often, the act of violence against women and trans people is committed by men who are, as we know, protected by other men, by laws, and even by states. They act according to their own sense of power and privilege as men, but this has nothing to do with their nature or even with any idea of masculine aggression. It has to do with how the social structure of masculine domination is reproduced. The act of killing and the practice of accepting it as a crime of passion or as a prerogative of masculinity are both moments in the reproduction of that social structure. We can say, for instance, that some populations are regarded as more grievable than others. But why should that be so? To grieve another is to stand in relation to that other. It is a social relation, one between people, but it is also one that is mediated by cultural and political modes of representation. Depending on the public sphere in which the loss takes place, it can be registered with great lamentation, great sorrow, or it can be dismissed or covered over as if it were no loss. What does it mean to say that one population appears within a given scheme of power to be more or less grievable? Obviously, we are speaking not about any inherent attributes, but rather the way that populations are represented and treated within dominant schemes of power. For a population that is targeted, abandoned, or left to die is already one whose lives do not count as lives within a framework that distinguishes on demographic grounds the grievable from the ungrievable. Sometimes ungrievable lives are not even considered lives, or or we could ask, is it the case that when and if a life or a set of lives becomes regarded as ungrievable, they cease to be considered as living? Okay. In other words, our lives as living people are considered grievable or ungrievable. If we were lost, someone would grieve. If we were lost, that loss would be felt, it would be acknowledged, it would be marked, it would be known. So we live our lives with a feeling, a sense that we are grievable, but we can also live our lives with a sense, a feeling that we are ungrievable. And some of us feel that we are grievable in one context and absolutely ungrievable in another. And we live with that dissonance, with that contradiction, with that paradox. Is the ungrievable life regarded as a non-living life? If so, in what sense? It could be a diminished form of life. It could be a form of social death, or it could be considered to be no life at all. To speak of grievability, the word grievability, I'm sorry, is a very awkward way to speak. One reason it is awkward is that we are used to talking about subjects who are capable of grieving, but we are less adept at asking whether people are eligible to be grieved, whether they qualify as someone to be grieved, whether as part of a group they have lost their right to be grieved, or they have gained eligibility to be grieved. There was an important question posed by the famous study published in Germany in 1967 called The Inability to Mourn, Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, by Alexander and Margaret Mitscherlich. That text, building upon Freud's work on melancholia, asked whether in post-war Germany there was a failure to mourn the massive losses inflicted by the Nazi regime, but also the losses borne by German civilians. The task of that book was to show not only that melancholia might characterize an individual psyche, but also a collective or shared condition, or more precisely, a national condition. What does it mean to speak about a national melancholia, right? An inability on the part of an entire nation to mourn a certain set of losses. It might even be a qualification of citizenship to refuse to mourn certain losses. Whereas mourning is characterized by the acknowledgement of loss, right? A loss has happened. It is real. Freud called that the verdict of reality. Melancholia refuses to hear or make the verdict. It refuses to make that important judgment that there has been a loss. It refuses to acknowledge a loss that at some level is, of course, both registered and refused. It's known and refused at the same time. It's that combination that is characteristic of melancholia and its disavowal of loss. If and when a population is grievable, they can be acknowledged as living, a living population whose death would be grieved if it were lost, if the life were lost, meaning that that loss would be unacceptable, would be wrong, would be an occasion of shock and outrage. Grievability is a characteristic attributed to a group of people, perhaps a population or a community, who are figured in a certain way by a discourse or within the terms of a policy or an institution. That attribution can happen through many different media and with variable force. It can also fail to happen or happen only intermittently and inconsistently, depending on the context, depending as well on how the context shifts. But my point is that people can be grieved or bear the attribute of grievability to the extent that their loss could be acknowledged. And that loss could be acknowledged only when the conditions of acknowledgement are established within an intersubjective field of some kind. And yet acknowledging a loss when there are no established conditions for its acknowledgement can break through the melancholic norm, can even break through the melancholic norm of a nation, activating the performative dimension of public grieving that seeks to expose the limits of the grievable and establish new, more comprehensive, more honest terms of acknowledgement. This would be a form of militant grieving, activist grieving, right? Political grieving, that breaks into public space and time, inaugurating a new constellation of space and time. We might prefer to say simply, as good humanists, that every life is grievable. And then we take the paper and we leave, right? That's the end of the story. It would be good if that were the end of the story. It is, of course, the end of the story, but how to get to that end is difficult. We can't simply assert it as a presupposition when there are so many places in the world in which it is not presupposed, right? We have to assess why it is not presupposed. So we might prefer simply to say that every life is grievable and to militate for an understanding of that basic equality. We may want to insist that, well, this is descriptively true. All existing life is equally grievable. But if we let that be the full extent of our description, we don't present reality very well. We misrepresent reality. So we should perhaps become frankly normative, right? Confess being normative without shame or hesitation, and say that every life ought to be grievable, positing a utopic horizon within which theory and description must work, right? Let's theorize in a world that we imagine to be one in which everyone is potentially equally grievable, potentially equally valuable. If we want to argue that every life is inherently grievable, precisely to claim a natural or a priori value to all our descriptive claims, then we are in fact presupposing a normative claim, namely that every life should be grievable. We should live in a world in which every life would be grievable. So this raises the question of why we ask our descriptive claims to carry that normative meaning in the way that we do. We have to point out the radical discrepancy between what is and what ought to be. So let us keep them distinct, at least for these kinds of debates. Theorizing within the terms of the present, the more appropriate descriptive claim is certainly not that all lives are equally grievable. So let us now move from what is to what ought to be, or at least to start that movement, which posits a utopic horizon for our work. And I thank Drusilla Cornell for teaching me that point, and I think also she derives it in part from Jacques Derrida. When one speaks about lives that are not equally grievable, one posits an ideal of equal grievability. There are at least two implications of this formulation that pose some critical problems. The first is that we have to ask whether there is a way to measure or calculate how much anyone is really grieved. How would we know whether people are equally grievable? By what calculus could we measure that inequality? Are there degrees of grievability? Well, it would be quite disturbing, if not counterproductive, to establish a calculus that could provide answers of this sort. So the only way to understand this claim that some are more grievable than others that some are, within certain frameworks and under certain circumstances, safeguarded against danger, destitution, and death more tenaciously than others, is to say precisely, with Derrida, that the incalculable value of life, is acknowledged in one setting and not in another, or that within the same setting, if we know what a setting is, some are acknowledged as bearing incalculable value, and others are subject to a calculation. Military decisions, well, what's the collateral damage? How many people are we willing to let die of famine? How many refugees do we stop in the sea? How many people do we allow to die on the other side of the border because we don't want to let them in? Well, at a certain number, there's going to be outrage. We can ignore that or we can accept that. Right? There are calculations. How many people can you possibly abandon or expose to death and still operate as a political power? To be subject to a calculation is already to have entered the gray zone of the ungrievable. The second implication of the formulation that not all lives are treated as equally grievable is that we have to revise our ideas of equality in order now to take into account grievability as a social attribute, an attribute attributed socially, that ought to be subject to egalitarian standards. In other words, we are not yet speaking about equality if we have not yet spoken about equal grievability or the equal attribution of grievability. Grievability, I would argue, is a necessary condition for equality. And the struggle for equality is linked, as we know, to the struggle against violence. But it also implies a commitment to a new biopolitics. When a population is regarded as ungrievable, it is first deprived of its status as a living population. If it is in some sense socially dead, or if it has been subjected to a necropolitical episteme, to use Achille Mbembe's terms, it can hardly be grieved under those conditions. Those are conditions that derealize the loss or disavow the loss, right? That produce this form of denial. Only that which has been regarded as living can be grieved, can be considered a lost life. A life that is, from the start, considered to be already lost from the start, cannot be lost in any meaningful sense. It cannot be grieved as a consequence. And yet, as we know, or I think we know, the life that is lost from the start, a lost life, a life that is no life, a life nullified as life from the start, it can be grieved, and it is grieved precisely because some people understand that it was, quite without knowing it, lost before it had a chance to live, and lived out all its chances as a form of perpetual loss. That is a form of grieving for the ungrievable, right? That's a form of grieving for the ungrievable. When we say that a life is ungrievable, we're not speaking only about a life that is already over. To live in the world as a grievable life, as grievable, is to know that one's death would be mourned, could be mourned. It is to have a sense of living in a world in which one's life matters, one's living body matters. But also, it is to know that this life will be safeguarded because it is of value, it's considered to be of value, that it will have the infrastructural ground it requires to live in a world with an open-ended future. And this way of evaluating the unequal grievability of lives is part of biopolitics. And that means that we cannot always trace this form of inequality to a sovereign decision-making process. In the final chapter of Foucault's 1976 lecture course, Society Must Be Defended, he elaborates on the emergence of the biopolitical field in the 19th century. There we find that the biopolitical describes the operation of power over humans as living beings. Distinct from sovereign power, biopolitics or biopower appears to be a distinctively European formation. It operates through various technologies and methods for managing life, but also managing death. For Foucault, this is a distinct kind of power, inasmuch as it is exercised over humans by virtue of their status as living beings. Sometimes he calls that living status, the living status of the person or the subject, a biological status, although he does not tell us which version of biological science he has in mind. Foucault describes the biopolitical as a power to make live or to let die, distinguished from the sovereign power to take life or to let live. As in many instances in Foucault's work, power acts, but not from a sovereign center. There are multiple agencies of power operating in a post-sovereign context to manage populations as living creatures, to manage their lives, to make them live or let them die. This form of biopower regulates, among other things, the very livability of life, determining the relative life potential of populations. This sort of power is documented in mortality and natality rates that indicate forms of racism that belong to biopolitics. For instance, the sociologist and historian Ruth Wilson Gilmore has written about the United States, and I quote, that racism is a state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Okay, so the way of defining racism is precisely to say that it divides people into those whose lives will be sustained, furthered, safeguarded, and those whose lives will be relatively abandoned or will not be given access to health care, shelter, basic requirements for making life livable. Racism is, for Gilmore, a relationship to grievability, I would say. I think that this sort of power also emerges in forms of pro-natalism and so-called pro-life positions. Pro-life positions care about some lives rather more than others, so pro-life positions are generally committed to inequality. Let's keep that in mind. I can lay that out if you want. Grown women's lives are not as important as potential lives, right? Teenage girls' lives are not as important as living tissue. Okay, just saying. So one point I wish to make is that the radical inequality that governs the grievability of persons, and we would have to, in a larger project, consider the calculus of grievability as it relates to animals, is part of the biopolitical, or one point where the biopolitical turns necropolitical in Ashio Mbembe's sense. One important claim is that those who are lost or violently effaced from life, those who are disappeared, ought to be openly grieved, since that would accord those lives value. Another claim is that only by becoming grievable do the living appear as alive, and do the dead appear as once having lived. Right? So grievability would be the condition of acknowledging life. To say that a group of people are grievable is to say that they should not be lost, that this loss should not happen, should not have happened, that the world needs to be reorganized in such a way to mark and forestall such losses. In other words, the recognition of lost lives makes them grievable and establishes the possibility of mourning. The radical assertion of grievability among and by the living gives rise to resistance to this hyper-precarious life. to protracted modes of living death, as well as to sudden and violent injury, detention, and state-sanctioned death. This is a resistance that is made not only in the name of life or the right to life, but rather against the political conditions that arrange for the deaths of some people and then cover them over. It is politically considered a railing against the censor by those whose voice, whose image, and whose action seeks to break through the scheme of representation that leaves them unrepresentable, unvalued, ungrievable. Bodies that resist the presumption of their ungrievability appear as such within the public. There's a great sign that very often shows up in Palestine, which simply says, "We exist." Right? Under what conditions is "we exist" a political act? Right? Under conditions in which existence is denied, right? Under conditions in which existence is systematically denied. The exposure of bodies in the context of demonstrations, I would suggest, shows that it is bodies that are deported, that it is bodies that are detained. It is bodies that are exposed to injury. It brings the body into public focus. It makes the wager and it makes a demand with the body's performative persistence. We might understand this as embodied persistence. Embodied persistence as part of the scene of activism. I am still persisting, we are still persisting, even though the infrastructures that would guarantee our persistence are failing or absent, right? The persistence indicts the failure of infrastructure and also resists that failure. Many resistance movements now depend upon collective bodies emerging together across borders. And that is not because there's something vital in the body. I'm not interested in vitalism. I mean, I'm interested in vitalism, but I'm not a vitalist. The reason bodies are important is not because vitalism is the answer or the key or the philosophy we need and want. It's rather that something becomes vital, becomes urgent in our relations to one another, and that is what we seek to bring into public view. Of course, we object to the loss of some lives, people who are lost through violent means, and we call it unjust, whether that is murder, could be state-sponsored murder, or it could be extra-legal murder. We have extra-legal states, so that makes it very complicated. We think it's unjust when people die of famine. There should have been enough food. We think it's unjust when people have been abandoned. They should have been sheltered. They should have been given passageway. They should have been given basic rights. But equally important is our objection to the loss of lives violently destroyed precisely because they were considered ungrievable from the start. That means those lives should have been considered as valuable. They should have had a chance to live. And what we grieve is not just the lost. What we grieve is the absence of the world that would have established those lives as grievable. Grief, of course, acknowledges loss. Grief acknowledges the value of the life that has been lost. But grief also acknowledges that this life was, in fact, a life, that it was living, and that its loss is a loss, the loss of its future life, the futurity that defines a livable life, because no one can live life in a livable way without some sense of futurity. The action of grief meets the action of justice precisely here, since we not only say this life was a life, it should have been lived, it should not have been destroyed, but also we say this destruction of life is unjust. It's wrong, it should never have happened. So we grieve and we oppose injustice, and that means that open and public sorrow joins with a militant opposition to injustice, and that just as we oppose violence in our grief and in our rage, we practice nonviolence as we mourn and as we militate against further violent destruction. As we think about feminism in the future, if we think about feminism and queer and trans activism and the future, it seems to me that we have to think about a return to the body, but the body not just as an immediately given thing, a discrete body. I don't know, I've never seen a discrete body. It seems to me bodies are always opening onto air and land and other bodies. They're connected through their openings and their skin and their senses. They're never bounded fully, right? They're always opening to something outside themselves. They only actually persist if they can open to something outside themselves. In fact, no body survives all by itself if it is not depending on others or supported by an environment. It will not persist, right? In any case, perhaps going forward, our slogan could no longer be "my body, myself." It always worried me. I mean, I like it, but it worried me. It struck me as American individualism at its best. My body, my property. I am property. I mean, it's great to say you don't own me, but do we have to say I am property? I am my own property, that's why you don't own me? Why not a deep critique of property? Let's go back to the early Marx. Let's go back to the body. I think both are important. The task is not just to defend individual liberty, although sometimes we must defend individual liberty for sure. If we accept that part of what a body is, and this is, by the way, an ontological claim, in case you want to criticize me for that, I'm going to make an ontological claim. Part of what a body is its dependency on other bodies, on living processes of which it is a part, on networks of support to which it also contributes, then we are suggesting that it is not altogether right to conceive of individual bodies as completely distinct from one another. Without conceptualizing the political meaning of the human body in the context of those institutions, practices, and relations in which it lives and thrives, we fail to make the best possible case for why, for instance, murder is unacceptable, abandonment has to be opposed, and precarity has to be alleviated. I'm suggesting not just that this or that body is bound up in a network of relations, that it is constituted by the network of relations in which it is bound up, but that the boundary between bodies both contains and relates. The body, perhaps precisely by virtue of its boundaries, is differentiated from and exposed to, at the same time, a material and social world that makes its own life and action possible. When the infrastructural conditions of life are imperiled, so too is life. I take this to be a materialist point that we can deny only at our own peril. See, I'm getting old, so I can say things like materialism. shock my audience. What difference does it then make if we understand the body in these terms? Well, I want to suggest that if we understand bodies as defined by their interdependency, and I suggested this in my lecture the other day, that this means that this body cannot really exist without another body, without other bodies in the plural. No, one body is self-subsisting. No one has ever in the history of the universe subsisted on their own. Subsistence requires relationality. It is not possible without it. The border, the boundaries, the site of its exposure to possible danger, but also the possibility of contact, excitation, passion, sexuality, the possibility of leaning, holding, even the wild sense that one might be caught in the middle of a fall, right? That I requires a you in order to survive and to flourish. These are social relations that ground the broader global obligations we bear toward one another. I cannot live without living together with some set of people. The fact that we are given over to one another without always choosing those to whom we are given over, that we do not choose our parents or our world, means that our lives are bound up with an unchosen vulnerability and an unchosen dependency. And for me, this is one of the most important critiques of liberal individualism that assumes that that choice is at the heart of our self. We can rail against this fact as if we should all be in full control, engaging only with those with whom we have a consensual contract. But that is a liberal conceit that denies the conditions of embodiment itself. Vulnerability is not a simply subjective state or disposition. It is always related to an object, a prospect, an impinging world, and is in that sense intentional in the phenomenological sense, not in the liberal sense. Vulnerability might take the form of excitability, susceptibility, longing, delight, fear, anxiety, or dread. But whatever form it takes, it is already and from the start a relational predicament. Individualism fails to capture the condition of vulnerability, exposure, even dependency that is presupposed by the right itself, and which corresponds, I would suggest, to a body whose boundaries are themselves fraught and excitable social relations. Whether a body that falters and falls is caught by networks of support, or whether a moving body has its way paved without obstruction, depends on whether a world has been built for its gravity and its mobility, and whether that world can stay built or be built again. The skin is from the start a way of being exposed to the elements, but what is done about that exposure is already a social relation, a social issue, a relation to shelter, to adequate clothing, to health services, to food. So if we seek to find what is most essential about the body by reducing it to its bare elements, we find that right there at the level of its most basic requirements, the social and the economic world is structuring the scene, impinging on psychic life at the level of fear and desire. Thus, the basic questions of mobility, expression, warmth, and health implicate that body in a social world where pathways are differentially paved, for instance. If we are physically challenged in some way, we need for there to be pathways that are paved. We need for there to be roads that we can walk on, or sidewalks, or what we call curb stops that help us, if we're in a chair, to move from the street to the sidewalk to get from one place to another. We rely fundamentally on that built environment in order to engage in fundamental actions of mobility and expression, right? But that is not just true for those of us who are physically challenged, but it is actually true for everyone to the extent that we depend upon infrastructural conditions of life in order to live. And only those of us who don't recognize the infrastructural conditions upon which we defend can start to talk about our lives as our own. You could still talk about your life as your own, but it's only your own to the degree that it is supported and sustained by other lives and by conditions that are not your life. In any case, we have to think about this world in which pathways are open or closed, where modes of clothing and types of shelter are more or less available, sometimes not available, affordable or provisional. It is from this uncertainty, this encroachment of death, that the question emerges, am I a life? Do I count as a life? And will the loss of this life matter? These are the questions I've been posing to you today. Whose bodies matter in life and in death, and why? Thank you very much.